All right, so let's jump right into we're doing a deep dive into BYD's third quarter report for 2024. I think a lot of you listening are probably wondering how this electric vehicle giant is really, are they cruising or are there some potholes on the road ahead?
Well, BYD is such a fascinating company. They're really a powerhouse out of China at the forefront of electric vehicles,
Yeah.
but they're also involved in other things like electronics and battery tech.
Yeah, and it really is mind-boggling when you think about the scale of their operation. I mean, over 200 billion RMB in Q3 revenue alone. That's just wild. So let's break down the report. First, the good news, right? Their year-on-year operating revenue that jumped by 24.04%. And net profit attributable to shareholders, that's up 11.47%. I mean, those are some pretty significant gains.
Yeah, those numbers definitely jump out at you right away. It really shows you how they're riding that global electric vehicle wave, and they're definitely making the most of it.
For sure, for sure. But here's where things get interesting. Their receivables financing has gone through the roof, like a 420.22% increase year on year. So can you explain what that means, like for people who don't speak fluent finance?
Okay, sure. So think of it this way. Let's say BYD sells a whole fleet of electric buses to a city. Instead of waiting for the city to pay the full amount upfront, they might sell that invoice to a third party, at a slight discount, and that way they get their cash quicker. But it could also mean slightly lower profits. That's basically receivables financing.
Gotcha. So this huge increase in receivables financing, is that kind of a sign that they're trying to push sales, even if it means, squeezing their margins a little bit?
Yeah, it could be. It definitely suggests aggressive expansion, which is interesting, but it also makes you wonder about their long-term, financial stability.
Right, right. Because what happens if those customers don't pay up on time? Okay, so now let's look at the cash flow statement.
Mhm.
There's a pretty big drop in net cash flow from operating activities down by 42.50%. Now, that to me, that's a red flag, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a number that needs attention for sure. What it means is that essentially BYD is spending more on its operations than it's bringing in. And if you look closely at the cash flow statement, you see there are increases in cash paid for goods and services and also cash paid to employees.
So is that a sign that costs are rising across the board, like maybe supply chain issues are driving up material costs? Or are they having to pay more for labor because they're expanding?
That's a very plausible explanation. Yeah, it definitely highlights a potential threat to their business model. Because if costs keep going up, it could impact their profitability even if their sales stay strong.
Right. Okay. Now let's move on to something a little bit intriguing. In the shareholder information section, we see that Berkshire Hathaway Energy Company hold a pretty decent chunk of BYD shares, about 1.86%. Now that's Warren Buffett's company, right?
Yes, it is. And, Buffett, he's known for being a long-term value-oriented investor. He doesn't just jump into anything. So his investment, it suggests that he sees something special in BYD, something that goes beyond, the hype of electric vehicles.
Yeah. That's definitely reassuring, especially with those cost concerns that we just talked about.
hmm
Okay, so where is BYD headed in the long run? I mean, they mentioned dual carbon goals in the report. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. So China has set some pretty ambitious targets for themselves. They want to peak carbon emissions before 2030 and then achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. So these dual carbon goals, as they're called, they're driving a lot of investment in green technologies.
And BYD, with its focus on electric vehicles and batteries,
Yeah,
they're perfectly positioned to capitalize on that, right?
absolutely. They are. It's a huge opportunity for them. But it also means that they are pretty dependent on China's commitment to these goals, right? Like, what if those priorities shift? Or what if global demand for electric vehicles cools down?
That's a really good point. So, while their growth right now is impressive, their future kind of hinges on factors that are a little bit out of their control.
Yeah, that's right.
It's fascinating how their story is really tied into these global trends. It reminds you that understanding a company's financials is just one piece of the puzzle. You really have to look at the bigger picture.
Absolutely. I mean, the electric vehicle revolution, China's environmental goals, even Warren Buffett's investment, all of these things add pieces to the puzzle.
Yeah, and speaking of Buffett, his whole philosophy is about finding companies with a moat,
Yeah.
that sustainable competitive advantage. So what do you think he sees as BYD's moat?
Hmm. Well, it could be a few things. I mean, BYD's vertical integration is really impressive. They control a big chunk of their supply chain. Everything from battery production to actually assembling the vehicles, and that gives them some cost advantages and more control over quality.
That's a great point. They're not just putting cars together, they're building the core components themselves, too. It's kind of like the difference between baking a cake from scratch and using a mix.
Yeah, exactly. And then beyond the technology, BYD has a really strong foothold in China, which is the world's largest electric vehicle market. They understand the local consumer and they've got these established distribution networks.
So they've got like the home field advantage in a market that's growing really fast. But let's talk about the potential downsides here. What if the global demand for electric vehicles slows down, or China decides to shift its focus away from those dual carbon goals?
Those are definitely valid concerns. I mean, relying too much on any single market or government policy is always risky. BYD needs to diversify their revenue streams and think about expanding into international markets more.
Right, putting all your eggs in one basket, that's
Definitely.
never a good strategy.
Yeah.
We've seen how vulnerable companies can be when things change suddenly in the global landscape.
Yeah, for sure. A key thing to watch is how BYD adapts to these potential challenges. Are they investing in research and development to stay ahead of the tech curve? Are they exploring partnerships or acquisitions to expand their global reach?
And of course, can they keep those costs under control while they're doing all of this? It's a pretty delicate balancing act. So for our listeners who are following BYD's journey, what's the one thing they should be keeping an eye on in the coming months?
I think I would say pay attention to their international expansion efforts. How successful are they at breaking into new markets outside of China? That's going to be a key indicator of their long-term growth potential. And also watch their cash flow situation carefully. Can they manage this expansion without putting their financial stability at risk?
Those are really great points to consider. BYD is a company with a really compelling story, impressive growth, ambitious goals, but also some pretty big challenges. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It certainly has. And remember, folks, exploring BYD's third quarter report, I mean, we've seen some really impressive growth. They've got a bold business model for sure. But there are also some potential threats that they're going to have to navigate.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
BYD is kind of at a crossroads right now.
Yeah.
On one hand, they're riding high on that EV wave,
Hmm.
but they also need to manage their costs carefully, diversify their markets,
Yeah.
not put all their eggs in one basket. And they have to stay ahead of that innovation curve.
It makes you wonder, with all these different factors at play, what's going to be the key to their long-term success? What do you think will determine if they become a global leader or if they get left behind? I think, in my view, it all comes down to adaptability. The automotive industry is going through a massive transformation. Can BYD evolve with it? Can they anticipate how consumer demand is going to shift, adapt to changing regulations, and embrace new technologies?
That's a really good point. It's not just about being big anymore. It's about being nimble and responsive in a world that's changing so fast. It's almost like they're sailing in uncharted waters.
Yeah.
They got to constantly adjust their course to navigate those currents.
Exactly. And that's what makes following their journey so compelling. We get to witness this high-stakes game of innovation, strategy, and adaptation, and it's all playing out in real time.
So for our listeners out there, next time you see a BYD car on the road, just remember there's a whole world of complexity behind that sleek exterior. It's a story of global ambition, financial risks, and this race to shape the future of mobility.
Yeah, and that story is far from over. We've only just scratched the surface.
Absolutely. So keep those questions coming, stay curious, and as always, happy deep diving.
Thanks for listening, everyone.